Corona has stopped us from doing so many things. But there are also the flip side of that, and events like this are really, really amazing. And I don't know if this would have been possible without Corona. I don't know if we would have thought of doing such an event. So it's good that there's a little sliver of positivity amongst all the negativity these days. I also wanted to say right at the beginning that if you expected a tour with an angry American conspiracy theorist named Alex Jones, you may be a little bit disappointed. I do believe in global warming, so if you expected someone else, maybe this is not the place for you. The other thing you can probably tell about somebody with a name like Alex Jones is that I'm not originally from Gaza. I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Israeli. You may be able to guess I'm the one New Zealand partner that Fred mentioned. And I've been living in Tel Aviv for about 3 years, and I've been the vice president of the Green Olive Collective for about 2. My first year here, I completed a master's in conflict resolution, and before that, I was a tour guide and led tours in, I think, 7 countries around the world now. But one place that I've never been is Gaza. I've never been to Gaza. And that is because since 2007, almost no foreigners have been able to visit Gaza. There are a few exceptions with some journalists and foreign aid workers, but it's been almost impossible, and still is almost impossible for anyone else to visit Gaza. And the same is true the other way around. It's almost impossible for the 2 million people of Gaza to leave. There are also some exceptions, some special permits which can be applied for, and we can talk about that later on. But it's basically a no one in, no one out situation. It's also very dangerous for most Gazans even to speak in a forum like this. The issue of normalization, that is normalizing the relations with Israel, is very, very sensitive in Palestine in general, Palestinian society in general, and in Gaza is actually illegal. So what I've done is talk to as many people as I can from Gaza, in Gaza, who've been to Gaza, and done an enormous amount of research to try and kind of combine all the different ideas and people that I've spoken to. I do feel a great sense of responsibility to try and tell so many stories in such a short amount of time, but I will do my best to do these incredible people justice, basically. The final thing I wanted to see is just by a kind of wave on the Zoom screen, how many of you have ever done a free walking tour before? I've spent many years giving free walking tours, a lot of good ways, good stuff. Yeah, I've made a living off free walking tours for the best part of a decade. If you've never heard of such a thing, I'll explain in the shortest possible way how they work. They're absolutely free to join. There's no expectation or pressure to pay anything for the tour. However, at the end of the tour, you're encouraged to pay whatever you feel the tour was worth. We decided to try and see if that model works also for virtual tours. In the days of Corona, there are many tour companies now experimenting with sometimes quite expensive virtual tours. And just like on a paid walking tour, once you've joined, it's kind of too late. If they're not very good, too bad. We decided to flip the model around. We allow you to join completely for free. And then at the end of the tour, if you've enjoyed yourselves, if you guys feel like I've added something to your knowledge, been interesting and informing, then you can pay whatever you feel the tour is worth. I do think that both the Green Olive Collective and the work we do is a very worthy cause. And of course, as Fred mentioned, the other added incentive is that about half of the proceeds from today's tour is going to this great charity in Gaza. So we really hope that at the end of the tour you enjoy yourselves, and we thank you in advance for whatever you feel the tour is worth paying. So that's, I guess, enough of an introduction. You know, a little bit about me and the work we do. I'd love to get things started by sharing my screen with you. Hopefully everybody can see this. Yeah, we all recognize this blue rock here. I don't know where in the world you are, but hopefully you're somewhere on this planet. And as we zoom in here, we can see the Mediterranean Sea and the triangle here of the Sinai Peninsula. And in the corner here where they meet is Gaza. Now, it's important to say, maybe right at the beginning here, that Gaza is both the name of a city, an ancient city, about 5,000 years old, and also a strip of land around that city. The strip today is about 40 kilometers long and about 10 kilometers wide on average. And often today when people talk about Gaza, they're kind of used interchangeably. And I'll try and be distinct when I mean one or the other. And as we zoom in here, you can already maybe see by the cursor that I'm drawing here where Gaza is. But these lines are entirely artificial. They're entirely man-made. If you looked at this map, even as recently as 100 years ago, this whole area would have looked very much the same. And I think that it's important to realize that geographically, there's no difference between this area and the neighboring jurisdictions. Because Gaza is at the edge of the desert, it's the first part of the desert which reaches the sea, and the edge of the fertile area here to the north, it's always been a crossroads. Many different empires have ruled here, and many of the greatest military men of our history have conquered Gaza. Everyone from Alexander the Great to Saladin to Napoleon Bonaparte. It's been ruled by Muslim empires since the early 600s, so about 1,400 years. And if you thought that New Zealand was perhaps the only empire that had nothing to do with Gaza, in a weird way, you're kind of wrong. Because where I'm going to pick up the story with a bit more detail is in the middle of World War I. In the middle of World War I, Gaza and all this area around it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. There was actually a group of Anzac, Australian and New Zealand soldiers, who marched along the coast here from Egypt, which was also part of the British Empire, into what is now Gaza. In World War I, the Anzacs conquered Gaza, and they actually destroyed basically the city. The ancient city of Gaza was really badly damaged.
There's usually you can hover and then.
I know, but when it's up to the computer.
Sounds like someone may have accidentally left the microphone off. We could just remind everyone, bottom left-hand corner, to mute your mic. That would be that would be great. Thank you. So for the next 30 or so years, from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, Gaza, and indeed all of this area around it, is administered by the British as the Mandate for Palestine. It was a League of Nations mandate. And if we switch to a different screen here, you should be able to see our next map. And this map shows what happened at the end of the British mandate. At the end of World War II, the British wanted to leave the mandate for Palestine, and along with the newly created United Nations, they decided to divide it up into two different states. One future state for the Jews, one future state for the Arabs. And on this map, for the first time, you can see a sort of strip around the city of Gaza here in the middle. Now, the British decide to implement this plan in November 1947, and in May 1948, they leave. Into the place left behind by the British, filling the vacuum, come the armies of the surrounding Arab countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and others, to dispute the inaction of this plan. Most of the Jewish leadership accepted this plan. It was a pretty good deal for Jewish leadership in mandatory Palestine, but the Arab leadership almost entirely rejected it. And in our context here in Gaza, this means that the Egyptian army come marching up the coast and meet a Jewish army coming down. The place where they have their first contact is here in Ashdod. Ashdod was where the two forces meet and where the tide of the war turns. The Jews then kind of march further down, and as they go, Jewish armies depopulate many of the towns and villages along this coastal area, and indeed throughout mandatory Palestine. Certainly many Palestinian villages and even people in cities, places like Jaffa, a very important Palestinian city, voluntarily flee the fighting, but also many villages were actively ethnically cleansed. So places like Ashdod become today the 100% Jewish city of Ashdod. Majdal becomes today the 100% Jewish city of Ashkelon. Now, by the end of the war, one important village, which was depopulated, is a small one called Al-Jura. I just bring it up at this point because one of the young men who was forced out of his village in Al-Jura and becomes a refugee in Gaza is a guy named Ahmed Yassin. And I wanted to bring him up now because he becomes an important character later on in the tour. By the end of the war, this is the situation. The Jewish leadership does proclaim the new Israeli state. They have a little bit more territory than the United Nations originally proposed them. They managed to add the pink areas here, 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 and along the state, which becomes known as Israel. The Palestinian state was never proclaimed. That is because the territory the United Nations had allocated it was split between Israeli control, here in the western bank of the Jordan River, Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip, which we see for the very first time, the modern borders here, which was controlled by Egypt. Now, the West Bank was annexed to Jordan. Jordan gives citizenship to the people there, including all of the refugees who'd fled these areas into the West Bank. That doesn't happen in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was only militarily occupied by Egypt, and there are a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that ostensibly the Egyptian army had come here to support their Arab brothers and to allow the creation of a Palestinian state. By annexing that territory, they felt it would be kind of a betrayal of that idea. But there's also more cynical reasons for it as well, and that is that if they gave citizenship to all the people living there, they would become citizens of Egypt, and they would probably end up as poor job seekers rioting on the streets of Cairo, which is something they did not want. To give you an idea, the population of Gaza before the war was about 88,000 people, and 200,000 refugees are added to that in 1949. It's an incredible change in such a short time. And this is a situation for about 20 years. The situation changes most dramatically again in 1967. This is the Six-Day War, when the small country of Israel more than triples its size in the space of just 6 days. Probably unique in military history that such a small area grows so fast. And in our context, the areas we want to consider mostly are number 3 and 4 here. The Gaza Strip, of course, and the Sinai Peninsula, conquered by Israel. Number 4, Sinai, was eventually traded back to Egypt in the peace agreement between the two countries. But the Gaza Strip was occupied by Israel and remains so to this day. It was not annexed. One thing which Israel does do almost immediately is start founding civilian settlements in the occupied territories. 21 blue dots, as you can see on my map here, were founded in the Gaza Strip. One of these blue dots was actually refounded. Kfar Dorom, literally the village of the south, right in the middle of the Gaza Strip, had actually been founded in 1946. Had been conquered by the Egyptian army and is one of the rare examples of depopulation happening the other way around. But the other 20 settlements were founded after 1967 and congregated here mostly in the southern corner. This becomes known as the Gush Katif block of Israeli settlements. Now, this situation lasted again for about 20 years. By 1985, to give you an example, a full 50% of Palestinians in Gaza are working in Israel. Now, mostly they're working fairly low-paid jobs, has to be said, but there was a good degree of economic exchange between the two areas, and there were no borders or checkpoints whatsoever. It's kind of hard to imagine today, but there was a bus leaving from Tel Aviv which you could take into the middle of Gaza City, and people did used to do that to eat fish and other things. But this all changes in the year 1987. In the year 1987, the first Intifada breaks out. And as well as giving us this kind of image, it really does change things a lot in Gaza. Now, if we change our view back to Google Earth, I can show you where the first Intifada begins. The first Intifada begins in one of the large Palestinian refugee camps, specifically the Jabalia refugee camp. This is the largest of the refugee camps. And with the power of technology, we can go zooming in and have a look at what Jabalia looks like today. Things haven't really changed that much since 1987 when the first Intifada breaks out. You can see it's not a tent city like you may imagine from a refugee camp. Remember, even in 1987, people had been living here for 40 years, but it's mostly quite simple construction, sort of cinder blocks put together. There's rubbish in the streets. The infrastructure is not very good. You can see dodgy wiring here, water tanks on the roof because water supply is intermittent at best, incredibly crowded living conditions, often raw sewage pours into the streets. And people have been living like this for, since 1949. Now, the first Intifada begins when an Israeli military truck hits and kills eventually 4 Gazans in this refugee camp. And the debate begins, who is to blame? Gazans feel this was a deliberate attack. Protests begin, they're quashed, things spiral out of control. And the first Intifada gets very, very violent, showing us kind of iconic images like this of the little kid throwing a rock at a huge tank. And the First Intifada arguably ends only with the signing of the Oslo Accords. This is a very famous image, which I'm sure you can all recognize, signed between the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, but he was not the only Palestinian leadership at this time. Arafat leads led, I should say, the party known as Fatah. But also during the First Intifada, we have his main rival being founded. You probably recognize Sheikh Yassin, who was the refugee from earlier on. He founds the Islamic resistance movement in the middle of the First Intifada. This is an acronym which in Arabic spells Hamas. Hamas today is recognized as a terrorist organization by the United States, the European Union, Russia, many other countries, but initially begins as kind of offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood had been founded in Egypt in the 1920s, and it existed in Gaza all the way through the Israeli occupation as an Islamic charity. They've done a lot of work in hospitals and schools and that kind of thing. But by the time that Hamas is founded, their charter is released, which kind of shows their new strategy. The new strategy is overtly anti-Semitic, is overtly in favor of violence. It calls for the destruction of the State of Israel. And they flat out reject the Oslo Accords. They say, Israel does not have the right to exist. We do not recognize their right to exist. And we completely reject the Oslo Accords. And they turn to violence early on in the 1990s and then increasingly in the 2000s. In the year 2000 begins the second Intifada. Intifada, by the way, means literally the shaking off. Now, the big difference between the first and the second Intifada is that in the first Intifada, the violence was restricted mainly to the territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and was very spontaneous and involved lots of non-violent resistance, lots of strikes, and this kind of thing. The second Intifada was much more violent, both by the Israeli army and by the various Palestinian factions. This photo here shows a very famous attack in Netanya, and there were these kind of attacks with great regularity in the Israeli cities like Netanya, Haifa, Jerusalem, big cities which hadn't really been used to this kind of violence until then. This is the beginning of the Israeli military crackdown, and specifically in Gaza, this is when the wall, which had existed since the end of the Oslo Accords, was rebuilt, greatly fortified, and the eventual decision is made in 2005 to withdraw all Israeli troops, all Israeli settlements, and all Israeli civilians from the Strip itself. The decision was made on the 18th of August, right at the end of the second Intifada. And people like Hamas claim this is a great victory. They say this only happened because of our violent action. Now, I can show you a video here which shows the eviction of the settlements. These images became very endearing, very visible to the Israeli public. The woman here crying, taking the last of her belongings and men being dragged out of their houses was very, I would argue, deliberately filmed. The Prime Minister of Israel at the time is Ariel Sharon, and he had, until this point, been considered kind of the godfather of the settlement movement. So for him to pull settlers out was seen as a real betrayal. And I would argue that the reason it was done in such a dramatic and visible way was so that future Israeli prime ministers wouldn't be able to withdraw from any future settlements. By the first Intifada, it was clear that, by the second Intifada, it was clear that Israel couldn't win the demographic battle. There were 8,000 Israeli settlers in Gaza. They were outnumbered 170 to 1, and the security cost was just becoming too high. Ariel Sharon was much more concerned with the settlements around Jerusalem and the settlements in the West Bank. The fact that these images became so controversial in Israeli politics, I think, is his plan to avoid ever having future Israeli governments pulling out from them. They also used quite young soldiers, as you can see here. Whoops, I'm supposed to see that for just another second. That's okay. quite young Israeli soldiers were used, and the tears of the Israeli soldiers becomes a very lasting memory, I think, for Israeli people. This is an image of one of the synagogues being destroyed. The decision was made that all the civilian buildings, all the homes would be demolished, but no synagogues were demolished by the Israelis. Instead, they left them within a few days. This was the fate for synagogues and the Gaza Strip settlements. Now, the next major change comes not long afterwards. In 2006, there was an election in Palestine, and much to the shock, it would seem, of Israel and the international community, Hamas actually stood candidates in this election. Now, they're overtly anti-democratic, but they managed to win the election. Initially, a kind of unitary government was formed between Fatah, the party that had belonged to Yasser Arafat, was now run by Mahmoud Abbas, and Hamas, but things don't last very long at all. By 2007, we had the outbreak of basically a Palestinian civil war. And at the end of this war, Hamas had control entirely of the Gaza Strip. Fatah remained in control in the West Bank. Now, with no Israeli soldiers or civilians in Gaza anymore, Israel considers Hamas completely in charge. But I would argue that the occupation does not end, because they restrict Hamas's control to airspace, sea space, and anything which comes in or out. And they begin in 2007 a blockade of the Gaza Strip. Since the Israeli withdrawal, you might be able to predict that the relationship between Hamas and the State of Israel has not been good. Both sides deny the other's right to exist, which means there's basically no proper communication between them, and there have been frequent outbursts of violence. From Israel's side, there have been 3 very significant wars launched with troops on the ground and planes in the skies in Gaza, with very serious numbers of victims. And in response, I would argue Hamas has returned with 4 major tactics. And I'll talk about each one for a minute or two, because this kind of dominates the Hamas-Israel relations in and around the Gaza Strip today. So the first thing I want to talk about is rockets. This is probably the most visible tactic which Hamas has used. And you may have seen the video playing earlier on, but I'll play it again for you. This shows a strike by a Qassam rocket on a highway in Israel. There've been approximately 40,000 of these types of rockets fired from the Strip into Israel. Here's a video again. Most of these rockets, like the Qassams being the most famous, are fairly low-tech. Hamas don't have a lot of resources. It's very difficult to get things in and out. So a Qassam rocket is basically a drain pipe or something similar, stuffed with a propellant like maybe fertilizer or some sort of explosive, shrapnel bits of metal, and then launched. They cannot control where they fire. They don't really have any control of the aim. And most of them land in open fields around the Gaza Strip. Some of them hit small Israeli towns. There are many small moshavs, kind of collective farms, and kibbutzim. And in this video, you can see what happens when a rocket hits a city. The one large Israeli city very close to the Gaza Strip is called Sderot. And this is a footage of a Qassam rocket hitting Sderot. These things are quite traumatic for the local inhabitants, particularly older people, children. And the time you have from when the siren goes off to when the rocket hits in somewhere like Sderot is about 15 seconds. Now, the only thing I would say, on the other hand, is that you can see the house in the video here still standing. The cars in the previous video drove basically right through the rocket strike. Unless you're hit basically directly by these rockets, the damage is fairly limited. What this does do is create a great sense of psychological trauma. But in terms of actual danger to your life, things are still fairly low. Israel's also developed the incredible technology known as the Kippah Barzel, or the Iron Dome, which can actually intercept most of these rockets before they hit the ground. There are, I should say, more sophisticated weapons that Hamas and other groups in Gaza possess. They do have, for example, smuggled Iranian weaponry, which can reach places as far away as Tel Aviv, but these have been fired far less frequently than the small-scale mortars and the Qassam rockets, most famously of all. Now, the second of the tactics I wanted to talk about are the tunnels. And again, with the amazing technology that we have on a virtual tour, we can actually take you inside a tunnel. This is a BBC journalist who's being toured around one of the tunnels in the Gaza Strip. This group is actually not Hamas. This is a rival group called Islamic Jihad. And this is one of their tunnels, dug underneath an olive grove. They can be used both to conceal firing locations. This here is a mortar hidden underground. And they can also be used for attack. The Israeli government doesn't release how many of these tunnels have been found, but they give us indications that it's about 35 of these tunnels which have been uncovered going under the border into Israel. Now, these tunnels have almost entirely, let's say entirely, been destroyed. The technology Israel is building now includes a high-tech underground fence, which stops these tunnels from penetrating under the border anymore. But there have been a couple of high-profile attacks. Maybe in the previous slide you saw the picture of Gilad Shalit, who was the Israeli soldier who was famously abducted through a Hamas tunnel. He was kept prisoner by Hamas in Gaza for 5 years before eventually being freed in exchange for over 1,000 Palestinian soldiers. 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, I should say. Now, without the tunnels, Hamas has turned to a new tactic. You've probably seen the marches which have been going on every Friday from 2018, known as the March of Return, the Great March of Return, in Arabic, Haq al-Awja. You've probably seen pictures like this of hundreds of Palestinians from Gaza massing on the border fences, demanding the right of return. This is the right to return to the homes in which them, and oftentimes it's their ancestors, were forced or fled from the fighting back in 1948. The images that you've probably seen on the news include pictures of young men throwing Molotov cocktails, burning tires like you see here, and generally acting violently. And of course that did happen. But the vast majority of protesters were protesting peacefully. And you can see in some of this footage here, protesters quite a long way away from the fence, doing things like praying and other cultural events. The vast majority of protesters in these marches were doing so peacefully. And Israel's response to the March of Return has been very heavily criticized in the international community. There was one Israeli fatality from these marches over the course of about 2 years. In response, there were 326 Palestinian deaths and 35,000 Palestinian injuries, compared to 7 Israeli injuries. The Israeli tactics were typically to fire tear gas and to shoot from sniper rifles towards the ground and towards the legs of the protesters. However, with the rocky ground, many of these shots were fatal, and the high number of Palestinian casualties, as I said, was very widely condemned by the United Nations and many other countries. The final tactic, which we can talk about maybe quite briefly, is the use of burning kites. This is another kind of, let's say, creative, I don't want to say positive, but creative tactic used by Hamas without any technology to remain a thorn in the side of Israel. They launch hundreds of these burning kites. Usually it's a Molotov cocktail or other incendiary device attached to something which can fly across the border. Again, it's completely uncontrolled, no way of knowing where it's going to land, but when they do, they can create havoc by burning, as you see there, over 6,000 acres of Israeli farmland and forest. One of the greatest tragedies of all of this is that not only is the Israeli response usually much more severe than the original act, but many of the rockets and many of the kites never even make it outside of the Gaza Strip. And it's thought that as many as half of the rockets which are fired, and probably a similar number of kites, actually land within the Gaza Strip. Living there before they even make it to Israel. So let's just go to sharing screen here. And we'll go back to people try and arrive places when they travel around the world, is to fly in. And Gaza does arguably have an airport. Yasser Arafat International Airport was opened in the early days of the Oslo Accords, but was bombed by Israel in the Second Intifada. And because there's so little resources in Gaza and so little is allowed in, the stone, as you can see in this picture, from the airport has been quarried and reused in other buildings. And you can see from aerial view here that there's really no way a plane could land at the airport. It's completely unusable. Not far away, I guess we could try and cross over by land. Not far from the airport is the Kerem Shalom crossing between Israel and Gaza. Now that crossing is open, but is not open to people. No people are allowed to cross through Kerem Shalom crossing. The only things which cross there are goods. You can see this big long tunnel here and huge terminals on either side. Basically the way it works, 2 trucks drive in, one from the Israeli side, one from the Gaza side, back to back. They have no contact, and goods are unloaded in a very time-consuming and expensive process, way over here in the bottom corner, farthest away from the population centers of both Gaza and Israel. So no people are allowed in. We can maybe talk more about the crossings later on if anybody has questions. The next crossing I want to talk about, which in theory could be used, is here between Gaza and Egypt, the Rafah crossing. One important point to note is that the blockade or the siege of Gaza, which has existed since 2007, isn't only an Israeli blockade. The siege is also maintained by Egypt, who do have about 10 kilometers of border with the Gaza Strip. Now, for most of the past 13 years, the Rafah crossing has been closed, as have the crossings with Israel. And Gazans are typically not able to use the Rafah crossing. For most of the past 13 years, the Egyptian government has been ruled by governments who don't particularly agree with Hamas's ideology, and they're concerned by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And so the crossing has been either closed or very carefully restricted. You may remember, though, in 2011, the Arab Spring. This brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power in Egypt. And during the year or so that they were in charge, under the government of Morsi, the Rafah crossing was open much more frequently, and many, many tunnels were dug between Egypt and Israel. Now, these tunnels were not used for attack, possibly used for smuggling weapons, but largely used for smuggling everyday goods. Some of the tunnels were enormous, and you could drive whole cars through these tunnels. And although the Israeli side, they say, have revealed and destroyed 30-something tunnels, on the Egyptian side, over 1,600 tunnels were discovered, and since the end of the Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt, eventually destroyed. So nowadays, we can say there are almost no tunnels between Egypt and Gaza, and the Rafah crossing remains open only on very special occasions for certain people, and Westerners, if you somehow did get permission, are not able to cross through this checkpoint. Westerners must use checkpoints between Israel and Gaza. Now, there are a couple of those, but most of those are closed. The Sufa crossing, closed since 2008. The Kisufim crossing, closed since 2005. This was the main checkpoint that the settlers used, so it's been permanently closed since the settlements were withdrawn. The Kani crossing and the Nakhaloz crossing, they've both been closed for 13 and 10 years respectively. The only crossing which remains a possibility for foreigners to get into Gaza would be the Erez crossing. The Erez crossing has been open from time to time over the last 13 years. However, very, very few people are able to use it. As I said at the beginning of the tour, some journalists are given permission, some foreign aid workers. To be able to come in, you need to coordinate this both with Israel and with the authorities on the ground in Gaza. That means Hamas, but also the Palestinian Authority, because Hamas and Israel don't talk to each other at these border crossings. So there's usually a Palestinian Authority kind of intermediary between the two. For Gazans to get out, the process is even more complicated. If anybody has questions about the permit procedures later on, we can talk about that in the questions and answers section at the end of the presentation. But it's very, very difficult for Palestinians to cross through the Erez crossing. You can see also from the aerial view this long kind of concrete walkway, which means you are never really that close to the fence in a sort of unsecured area. The other interesting thing you can see from this view, which I find fascinating, are the ruins of the Nitsanit settlement. You can kind of see the cul-de-sac here. I think this is just another really cool thing which we'd never be able to see on a real tour, but with the power of satellites and Google Earth view, we can see what happened to the old settlement. So we can't come in by air. We've said we can't really come in by land. This yellow line, the 20 nautical miles, which under the Oslo Accords, Israel and the Palestinian Authority agreed Gazans would have free access to. We're largely talking about fishermen here, so they'd be able to fish anywhere in this 20 nautical mile radius. Since the beginning of the siege, and in fact even before, since the Second Intifada, this has never in one single day been the case. The largest it's ever been is 10 nautical miles, which is about half of this, and it changes very frequently. Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 10. And the Gazan fishermen are expected to kind of know about these very arbitrary changes in the fishing zone. The other zone I've marked here is the smaller zone here. This is the 6 nautical mile fishing zone which exists around the port of Gaza. This is what's been the case for most of the past 13 years. Most of the boats in Gaza are in this little old fishing port, and this is the size which they are allowed to enter. One last important thing to say about this is that as well as having a really serious human toll, this also has a very serious environmental toll, because overfishing has become a massive problem in Gazan waters. Not only is the water closest to the shore the most polluted, but it's the water where the youngest fish live. So Gazans have been forced to fish the youngest of the stocks in this small area, and overfishing has become a really, really serious problem. So look, I guess we couldn't really enter anyway at all, but luckily for us we have virtual technology. So we can go in and have a look around despite not being able to really get in there physically. This is a view of the port of Gaza. You can see here, very idyllic, nice little fishing boats. And one thing which I think a lot of people don't realize about Gaza is that like anywhere in the world, it's complicated. There are nice parts and there are not so nice parts. And the view here from the sea, from the Mediterranean coastline, is very, very nice, it has to be said. And I'd love to show you guys now one small video which gives us a little bit of an aerial view of Gaza and maybe shows you the complexity of this place. We'll let the video play. It's about a minute long and shows how Gaza looks from the air. You can see small areas of private housing. You can see the port here. You can see beautiful modern mosque, which we'll take a look at later on. You can see the densely populated refugee camps. Of the 2 million people living in Gaza, about 1.4 million of them have refugee status. We can talk about that later on. This is the downtown of Gaza City, the Rimal neighborhood, which is again quite a high-end neighborhood. The port again. The beautiful Mediterranean Sea. I think a lot of images which maybe people wouldn't usually expect to see when they think of somewhere like Gaza. You can also see, of course, the ever-present fence and Israel not far away. It's one of the most densely populated places on earth, Gaza. Of the 2 million people that are crammed into Gaza, if Gaza was its own independent country, the only places in the world which would be more densely populated would be Monaco and Singapore. Everywhere else in the world is less densely populated than Gaza. So from here in the port, we're going to go next into the city of Gaza. The first thing I'd love to show you is this monument here, which sits on the seashore. This is a monument to a ship which you might have heard of, the Mavi Marmara, which was a Turkish boat which tried to break the blockade. In the year 2010, a small kind of armada, a small group of ships set sail from Turkey via Cyprus, trying to come to Gaza with activists on board. The Israeli Navy intercepted the ship before it could arrive here. A firefight ensued. One Israeli naval officer and 10 international activists were killed in this action, caused a huge international outcry, and this is the memorial built to the ship, the Mavi Marama. On the other side of it, you can see a construction site. When this photo was taken a few years ago, what was there was not yet built. But again, with the power of technology, we can go inside. This is the beautiful Al Hasina Mosque, which I think is, of all the mosques I've seen in Gaza from my research, the most beautiful mosque. It was paid for by the government of Turkey. Very new, very, very beautiful. If we look up to the sky, you can see the beautiful dome covered with Arabic calligraphy. Turkey do maintain relations with Hamas, as do a few other countries, notably Iran and Qatar. Another couple of features you can see in the mosque here is the Qibla wall. This is the direction of prayer. All mosques face the direction of Mecca. This is the minbar where the imam will give the sermons, and these lines on the floor are not just for decoration, although the carpet is beautiful. These give Muslims the required spacings for prayer, so people line up along these lines for prayer. Okay, so if we jump out of the mosque, we can now take a little aerial look at 2 of the 9 universities which exist in Gaza. These are the Al-Azhar and the Islamic universities in this nice campus not far from this seashore. The population of Gaza is incredibly well educated. Huge number of people go to university, almost 100% literacy rates, but the unemployment in Gaza is so overwhelming that even your education isn't really a tool to get out of this. The latest statistics from the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics indicate that about 45% of Gazans are unemployed. But because of the coronavirus and various changes over the last 6 months since those statistics were released, most estimates put the overall unemployment rate now at about 60%. Which is really just a staggering number. And among graduates, that number is typically even higher, because if you have a university education, there's just not that much for you to do with it, which is a real tragedy of such a proudly well-educated people. Unemployment among women is also higher, according to the Palestinian Statistics Bureau, is 62% for women, as opposed to 45% for the average. And unemployment is really a huge problem in Gaza. So if we zoom across to the next site, this is the bottom of one of the most beautiful boulevards in Gaza. And the building at the bottom is the Palestinian Legislative Council. Were we to visit Gaza, I'm afraid there's not much to see. The building was bombed by Israel in one of their aerial raids. And of course, the Palestinian Legislative Council, which is kind of like the government of Palestine, hasn't met properly since the civil war between Fatah and Hamas. There's been a few attempts to form unitary governments, but none of them have really succeeded. But it does sit at the bottom of this beautiful boulevard. And I'd love to show you another quick bit of video, which shows the view looking up Omar Mukhtar Boulevard. Now, if anybody's been to Jaffa, which is today, of course, part of Tel Aviv in Israel, this boulevard was actually built exactly the same time by exactly the same people, and originally given the exact same name as what is now known as Jerusalem Boulevard in Jaffa. Originally, it was Jamal Pasha Boulevard, built under the Ottomans in 1915. And this runs through the middle of the Rimal neighborhood of Gaza City. Along this boulevard, you find most of the important institutions. The Central Library is there, one of the main offices of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which does an enormous amount of work feeding and educating Gazans. We can talk about them perhaps in the question and answer section if people are interested. And the boulevard here runs all the way from the seashore up to the old town of Gaza City, which is kind of the central hub still today of Gaza City. Now, this drone footage doesn't take us quite that far, so we'll share Google Earth again, and we'll take a look at what the old city of Gaza looks like. You can kind of see almost a ring here in the way that the streets are slightly different from the streets around. And along the back side, you can see one of the main roads of Gaza. This is the Salahuddin Street, which is actually part of one of the oldest roads in the world. Today it goes all the way from the Erez crossing with Israel through the middle of Gaza to the Rafah crossing, but originally was part of the Via Maris, one of the old Roman roads, which runs all the way along the coast of the Mediterranean here. And I found this really neat map which shows Gaza. This is a British engineer's map which shows Gaza in the 1850s. And you can see a lot of similarities. This is Salahuddin Street here, if you can see with my cursor on the street view running this way. This is the Maidan Palestine, Palestine Square, which is like the main square at the entrance of the old city. Maybe we can make the map just a little bit bigger. And you can see it in more detail here. Here's the old town, Salahuddin Street. And right in the center of the old town, as in most cities around the Middle East, we find the Great Mosque. We can actually take a look at these buildings now. We can have a look inside the Great Mosque of Gaza. Here is the minaret. Beautiful arches, very typical of the Mamluk architecture. This mosque was built during the Mamluk reign in the 1200s under the reign of the Sultan Baybars. Here's the main entrance of the mosque. It's also known as the Omari Mosque, named after the second caliph of Islam. Caliph Omar was the one who brought Islam to the Middle East. And you can see another picture here, which I've chosen because it shows really clearly that the mosque used to be a church. The mosque today is built on the foundations of a church dedicated to St. John the Baptist, which was built by the Crusaders, who briefly ruled here in Gaza. This picture comes from the end of World War I, when it was bombed very badly by Allied forces. Now, not far away from the mosque, the Great Mosque of Gaza, is a church. Now, the population of Gaza today is about 99.9% Muslim, but there is still a small Christian community. Estimates put it at about 1,000 people today. This is the Church of St. Porphyrius. You might be able to guess from the decoration, it is an Orthodox church. There are 3 churches in Gaza, one Catholic, one Evangelical, and one Orthodox. To me, this is the most beautiful, these beautiful frescoes and these amazing icons. And this church is still active today. Now, there's lots of reports of tensions between the Christian and Muslim communities. I'm sure it would not be fun to be a religious minority under a government like Hamas. But legally and officially, Christians are allowed to practice in Gaza, and they do continue to practice in churches like this. St. Porphyrius, by the way, whom the church is named after, was the first bishop of Gaza from the Byzantine era, and he's buried in this beautiful little church. Now, if we leave Gaza City for a while, there's a couple more things I want to show you before we wrap up the tour. Not far away from the city is a water park. You might not believe that there's a water park in Gaza. It's struggled to stay open, and Hamas has also cracked down on it, but there is such a thing in Gaza. And also not the most kind of typical thing you'd expect to see on a tour of Gaza, but something I think is really important to show you is the Gaza power plant. Now, the Gaza power plant, there is one of them in the city of Gaza. The Gaza power plant has been barely operational since the siege began. It was bombed by Israel and has been restored and refueled only in the last few years with power and fuel from the government of Qatar. Now, many people say this legitimizes Hamas and shouldn't happen, but it does mean that the Gazan people have a little bit more regularity when it comes to power. Power is something which affects all aspects of life. There's an amazing statistic which says that an 11-year-old child in Gaza today has not had more than 12 hours of continuous power their entire life, because power has been so intermittent since the siege began. And power, of course, affects all sorts of things. It affects your ability to work. There's effectively no industry or manufacturing in Gaza. It affects your ability to study. It's very difficult to study without good light and reliable energy to charge your computer and this kind of thing. It affects healthcare without refrigeration of medicines and without reliable machinery, healthcare really suffers as well. So I think that the Gaza power plant is the source of a lot of the everyday problems for Gazans. And many people, if you talk to Gazans, this is one of those kind of constant everyday annoyances. You have to plan your whole life around the few hours a day when you may or may not be given power. So we're nearly there, and we'll do some questions in just a moment. But before we do that, I think the most important thing to finish with, because we have seen some of the good sides of Gaza, some of the more difficult sides of Gaza, but I think that the most striking thing that's really affected life here more than any other is the aerial bombardment, are those 3 great wars that Israel has fought here. And no neighborhood bears the scars of this more visibly than Shajaya. Just on the other side of Salah ad-Din Street from the old city, quite close to the border with Israel. And I'm going to finish the kind of tour part of today with one more video. I'll just share the screen, which shows aerial footage of this neighborhood. Now, Israel claims that Shajaya was a Hamas stronghold. Many tunnels were dug from here and that many rockets were fired from here. Now, no doubt that's true, but as you can see, it's an incredibly densely populated part of the Gaza Strip. And when you launch, huge aerial bombardment of such a densely populated area, the civilian toll is just catastrophic. And you can see how complete the devastation of neighborhoods like Shajaya are in this incredible drone footage. Much of Shajaya tragically still looks this way today. Between 2007 and 2012, no concrete was allowed to enter the Gaza Strip. Now that's changed a little bit more recently, but for those long years, these buildings were not able to be rebuilt. That is because Israel controls almost everything which comes in and out of Gaza, and concrete, along with many other things, is considered dual use. That means it could be used for civilian purposes, like rebuilding houses, but it could also have a military use. And Israel says there's no way we're going to allow anything into Gaza which could be used to attack us. And that is why, for much of the last 13 years, concrete and many other seemingly trivial things have not been allowed into the Strip at all. So I do hope that on that very brief kind of historic summary and little tour of Gaza, you were able to get a bit of an understanding of what life in Gaza is like for people who live there, and what life could or would be like for people like us, maybe foreign visitors, if we were able to go and visit. But I think that I'm sure, in fact, you'll have many, many questions to ask. And I'd love to throw the scene over to you guys now to hear what you thought about it and what questions you have. So I'll pass things back to Fred, and Fred's going to moderate a couple of questions, some which he finds interesting or relevant, and let's get into it, shall we?
Okay, thanks, Alex. Now you should know that a lot of your comments and things that you omitted have been very controversial with our audience today, which is quite interesting. We often will, presentations will often get people upset. More often than not, it's some Zionists who come on these tours also, who take exception that what they say we're not giving enough of the Israeli side of things. Today it's the opposite. It's passionate pro-Palestinian activists who are in our group today who feel that you've been giving too much emphasis to the Israeli side of things. And in fact, I think even one person called us a, let me just get this right. Hang on a second, I'm going to quote you. This tour group is trying to push the Israeli political view, is what one person commented. And there's been many other comments like that. So I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit, Alex, about the Israeli war crimes and human rights violations in the Gaza Strip, to maybe just let everybody know that we do have a certain perspective, and we're certainly not a Zionist front organization, as a couple of people seem to suggest.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm sorry to hear that that's upset people, and I obviously didn't set out to offend anybody. But yeah, I guess we do sort of straddle a little bit multiple perspectives, and typically we do get feedback from the extreme ends of both sides. So maybe that's I don't know, maybe that's a good sign. But I hope that there are still some constructive questions, and if anybody does have more political issues you want to talk about later on, we can obviously do that as well.
Okay. To ask some of the people who have been making comments to turn their comments into questions for Alex. Challenge Alex in the same way that you've been making the comments on chat. There have been no specific questions actually being asked. One from Anne, refugees. Anne, do you want to ask your question? Okay. Anne has written, there's 1.4 million refugees living in Gaza. Can you talk a little bit about the history of those refugees, where they come from?
Well, that's a great question, Anne. If indeed it was Anne who asked it, I'm not sure. But yeah, we can definitely talk a bit more about the history of the refugees. So at the end of the 1948 war, it actually ended in 1949, which makes things extra confusing. There were about 700,000 displaced Palestinian refugees. These people were taken care of by a brand new United Nations organization called UNRWA. Now, this is the first time in United Nations history, all the way up until today, when a refugee crisis was given a specific body to manage it. So the United Nations Relief and Works Agency deals only with refugees from this crisis. And initially it was set up as a kind of emergency relief agency just to help these people put food on the table from one day to the next. But it quite quickly kind of evolves into managing their day-to-day life over many, many decades. The 700-something thousand Palestinian refugees are spread all around the world, the majority of them in the countries nearby where they live. So some of the refugees are not that far away from their original homes, places like Lebanon, Syria, and of course Gaza. Now, the only place in the Middle East where these refugees were given citizenship is Jordan. Most of these refugees remain stateless and continue to have this refugee status to this day. One of the other interesting things about UNRWA is you don't pass on your refugee status to your children. So that number 700,000, which UNRWA dealt with in 1949, has exponentially grown. So nowadays there are 5 million refugees, again, spread throughout the world, and about 1.4 million of those are in Gaza. So the UN UNRWA headquarters are located in Gaza. And they do an enormous amount of work to help feed and educate the Palestinian refugees in Gaza. They're also a very kind of useful way for international governments to be able to help people in Gaza, because most Western governments certainly forbid charities or their own governments from donating money to Hamas. And so a lot of donations will come to UNRWA, which help with schooling and that kind of thing of the people there. So that's kind of a very brief history of how those refugees came to be in Gaza and who kind of looks after them today.
Thanks, Alex. I know my audio seems to have been breaking up. Does it sound okay now?
No. No.
It doesn't.
No, it's terrible.
Yeah, that was good.
Seems to be a
It's
small
only your-
internet problem at my end, and I apologize for that. And, Alex, okay, yeah, your screen share is off. Somebody asked for your screen share to be.
Could Alex repeat the questions after you ask, because that we can hear him well?
Great, I'll do that. I'll repeat the questions that Fred suggests, or maybe Fred, if there's anyone who wants to be called upon, they can ask their own questions. That's always a good idea too.
You have a question to ask. Would you like to ask it?
I have a question.
I'm afraid we didn't hear Fred who you called upon to ask the question.
Yeah, I guess Mindy doesn't want to ask her question, so I'll ask it for her.
Who?
Can Can you hear me okay, Alex?
No.
No, okay. I think Alex should take over asking the questions. Do you see the
I'm happy to
chat?
do that.
You see Mindy's question?
Oh,
Yeah,
I can say it. I can do it. The UN has said that the Gaza Strip will be unlivable by 2020. It's 2020. Why are you not mentioning the U.S. cuts to UNRWA that increase hunger and the reduction in potable water to very, very little? Why are you not mentioning that this is not a tenable ongoing situation for the people in Gaza and needs to be changed if only the world community would speak out against the ongoing occupation of the Strip?
Thanks, Mindy. Look, I completely agree with everything you said. The only reason I didn't point it out is because of the amount of time we have available. But if anyone didn't hear Mindy, I think it does absolutely bear repeating. It was, I think, 2014 when the United Nations said Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. And that has, of course, happened. 2020 has come by. And yeah, the international community really doesn't do much about it. It's an absolute humanitarian crisis. And again, if that was not clear in the presentation, I apologize, because it's something I absolutely believe. The water issue is really important, and that definitely is worth spending another couple of minutes on. The number of people who had access to water in Gaza as recently ago as the year 2000 was 98.3. That's according to an NPR report quoting UNRWA. So 98.3% of Gazans had access to drinking water in the year 2000, just by turning on the tap. That number has dropped to 2% today. There is a coastal aquifer which runs along the coast in Gaza, which has been so heavily used, the resources are so in demand and so poorly managed and so overused that the water level has dropped. So nowadays we have seawater effectively poisoning the well. And there's basically no drinking water in Gaza anymore. The water which Gazans drink almost entirely has to be bought. It's another incredibly expensive part of life there. And again, this is an absolute humanitarian tragedy, which really not much has been done about in the international community. The pollution of the water is also caused a lot by sewage. There's a couple of sewage treatment plants in Gaza, but these plants don't have enough energy to run properly. Because the power plant has been so scarcely operational, the sewage treatment plants are often just sitting there inactive. So the sewage, when you flush the toilet in Gaza, enters the plant, fills up, and without being treated, it just flows into the overflow pipes and out to sea. So as well as the great, humanitarian crisis there's also a growing environmental crisis. And this is something which affects all the surrounding countries of the Mediterranean, including Israel. So there's actually an urgent need to help this issue, not only for the Gazan people, certainly primarily for the Gazan people, but also for the surrounding countries of the Mediterranean to do more on this issue as well.
Alex. Barbara had a question. Barbara, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, it is a bit hard to hear you, Fred. I apologize. I'll try and look through the chat and see if I can call on anybody else. It's just very difficult to read the chat while I'm also presenting. So let's see if I can find an interesting question maybe we can talk about.
Barbara Williams was trying to ask a question.
Thank you, whoever that was.
Sure, Barbara. Let's have a question from you. Thanks for helping us there, Mindy. How are you, Barbara? What's your question?
I'm fine. My question is, as it's written, are any of the universities in Gaza, you said there were 9, are any of them recognized transferable credits, etc., to Western universities at all?
Great question. I don't know if they're transferable. Certainly the degrees which they give are typically recognized. There are plenty of Gazans who, well, not plenty, there are some Gazans who have these qualifications and have been able to get out and work in other places. I also saw a question in the chat there about women at university. And yes, women are able to go to university. They're segregated universities. So men and women don't study typically in the same classrooms, but women can go to university and do go to university. And usually the qualifications are recognized abroad. I don't know if credits themselves are transferable, but I fear this is all a bit of a moot point, because the more difficult thing is actually getting out of the Gaza Strip to be able to use them in the first place. That's much more difficult. But it's a good question if they're actually, transferable credits. I don't know the answer to that.
Just one last question.
Sure.
Our instruction is always in Arabic. And is there any Hebrew spoken anywhere in the university courses?
In the university courses, no. What you do find from talking to Gazans is that people of a certain age tend to speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
Back in the 1980s, 1985, like we said, so many people worked there. So there are Hebrew speakers there. But today, very, very little Hebrew is, certainly not in education or that kind of thing. No Hebrew at all. You might see occasionally Hebrew products. There are still some Israeli products in Gaza, but no, Hebrew's.
All right. Thank you.
Getting any better?
It's not, but Fred, if you have anyone you want to call upon, let's try one more time.
No, it wasn't.
A few people asking questions. Dan actually has a microphone.
We don't really hear you, I'm afraid. Is that perhaps, Dan? Did I hear the name Dan? Did Dan want to ask a question? Yeah, there we go. Fred calls on Dan. How are you, Dan? Do you have a question for us?
You have to read it. Hey, Barbara, you want to read it?
What about if Fred chats the questions to Alex? He keeps choosing them, but he can put them to Alex in the chat privately.
That's a great idea, Deborah. Thank you for that. Do you want to do that, Fred? Maybe you can just send the messages to me privately, and then I'll be able to read them out.
Okay.
There is a question about mental health in the chat. That's certainly important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, mental health is a huge issue. There was a report by World Vision which said that children in Gaza are psychologically becoming unable to envisage the future. And when I read this, those words just shook me to the core. The fact that the uncertainty around daily life is so high that they're psychologically becoming unable to do this is just incredible. And there's such a number of factors affecting mental health. We talked about water, we talked about education, we talked about the ability to put food on the table. These things have really serious ramifications. And actually, UNRWA are trying their best. I read another report from UNRWA talking about their work to try and bring in foreign mental health practitioners to try and stimulate that sector of the economy and of the medical profession. But with so many kind of pressing issues, I think for most international donors, a much more sexy project is always the big ticket items, putting schools and food on tables. And it's really tragic that mental health so often gets overlooked. But I think that there is a slow shift towards more emphasis on that. So I'm reading here from Fred, one of the questions which came from Dan, which is, why do the Israeli reactions to Palestinian actions seem to be several times larger? Is it just monetary advantage, or is there an ideology behind the seemingly heavy-handed bombings? I guess to answer that question, I would say, first of all, the military capacity of the two sides is just so different. Israel possesses one of the most technological armies in the world, all the weaponry you could imagine, and Hamas, despite their pariah status, and everybody in Israel is very afraid of what Hamas is able to achieve. They're actually very limited in their reach and in their armory. So I think that just that fact alone means that any Israeli action is going to be much, much greater than any Hamas action. And Israel does have the policy that, for example, where a Hamas rocket is fired from is kind of fair game. There has been accusations that they deliberately fire from hospitals and schools and mosques, but where a rocket is fired from, Israel will completely obliterate, will destroy. So there is, I guess, a kind of policy to some extent, but I think mostly it comes down to technology. And I guess the final thing I'd say about that is Israel's obsession with security. Security is kind of the first, second, third, and fourth priority for the Israeli government. So if there's a chance that a rocket could be launched from somewhere again, they'll absolutely take that possibility off the table. And I think that the Israeli public, to an extent, demand this. Israel has experienced these traumas, and the Israeli military is able to confront them militarily. And I think that the Israeli voters, support these actions by and large by voting for parties which do these things. The next question, which Fred has pasted here for me to read, is on what conditions can a person leave Gaza? And that's a great question. And I've got the latest stats here from the United Nations about how you can get out of Gaza and how many people get out of Gaza. There are a couple of different permits which people are able to use. The most common way for people to temporarily leave Gaza is on a medical issue. There are humanitarian cases where people are able to leave Gaza for short term. Typically it's to seek treatment, which is unavailable in the Gaza Strip. And they're able to usually do that in hospitals in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank. So, for example, in September 2019, there were 17,000 crossings in that month in both directions through the areas crossing. Some of those people were, like I said, holders of these kind of humanitarian health permits. The other way is to apply for a trader's permit. And there are about 6,000 of these which are given, which allow merchants from Gaza to come and buy and sell goods in Israel. And now it's kind of an open secret for many people that I've talked to that a lot of these merchant visas are actually being used by people to do kind of day jobs in Israel. That allows them to earn much higher wages, and they inevitably are forced to come back every night to stay in Gaza at the end of their work. But about 6,000 of those exist as well, going back and forth. There are other exceptions. There's always exceptions to the exception. There are, in certain cases, people who can apply to travel abroad for conferences and this kind of thing, but this number is very, very, very small. The vast majority are these trader permits or the health permits. And I should say as well that over 50% of the health permits, and this is accepted and officially recognized by Israel, over 50% of the permits which they receive are denied. So it's not like just because you have a rare form of cancer, you're going to be able to be treated outside of Gaza. Again, about half of those permits are denied straight off the bat. So the conditions are very, very difficult. Now, the next question that Fred has put here comes from Margaret. And the question is, how does Hamas stay in power? And I guess to talk about that, we should maybe break it into two parts. The first is where they receive their funding. Hamas has largely been funded in the past by Islamic foundations, charities, that kind of thing. But those have been very heavily cracked down upon. It's very, very difficult now to give money to these kind of organizations. So the majority of the funding now comes from the government of Iran, and increasingly important is the government of Qatar. They partially see it as supporting the people of Gaza, and also like an Islamic act of charity, which is of course very important to devout Muslims. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is to be charitable, and the people of Gaza are innocent in all of this. So how the money gets to them is not really that significant in the eyes of many. So Hamas do have this source of revenue from abroad, and then within Gaza, they certainly do rule, with an iron fist. There's no two ways about it. Hamas is not running a democratic system in Gaza. I mean, there's a serious military presence there. Things are controlled quite tightly by Hamas in terms of civil society. Mixing of men and women is becoming much, much more rare. Things like, there are no cinemas in Gaza. We mentioned briefly the water park, which has been closed on many occasions by Hamas. So I think that dissent against Hamas is very, very difficult. Even people who are affiliated with rival factions, like we talked about Fatah, many of them have been under great danger and have left the Gaza Strip if possible because of their ties to Hamas's rival faction. So for mine, those are, I guess, the two most important kind of factors keeping Hamas in power. The next question comes from Sherry. You've mentioned the desire of Israelis for security. What about the Palestinian need for security? Absolutely. I mean, it's a human right to live without the fear of your water being cut off, your house being blown up, your job being lost, and your life being taken. So yes, absolutely, the Palestinian right for security is critically important. And I think that's where, in the context of Gaza, the international community comes in. And that's what we're really hoping to do by having these kind of events, is to keep Gaza in the spotlight, because it's so easy to kind of, once it's out of the news, think that it doesn't exist anymore. And the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not going away on its own. In fact, it's getting much, much worse. And the international community, I think, does hold the key in many ways to the humanitarian response. Maybe not to the peace process or kind of bigger questions like that, but at least to solving the humanitarian crisis. And something which I didn't mention earlier on, which perhaps I should have, is the serious cuts to the funding of UNRWA and to USAID by the Trump administration. UNRWA was funded about 50-50 by the United States and the European Union, and the Trump administration nowadays gives exactly $0 to UNRWA, and they've cancelled every single USAID project in the Gaza Strip. So the funding for these institutions has just been cut in half in many cases. So if you are someone who is a voter in the United States, there is a lot you can do to help re-establish a lot of these institutions and give the Palestinians in Gaza their human right, which is, of course, security. Now, another question I have here is from Fred, and I realize I should be asking you to ask them aloud, so I apologize for that. But maybe Deborah Katz, if you'd like to ask that question aloud.
Okay. What I wrote was, I was struggling a little bit for the right words, but from what I know, Muslim nations and societies vary a good deal in the level of orthodoxy. Can you give us a sense of Gaza on this spectrum, an example or two? I think what we hear in the US is, extremely restrictive and that kind of thing. And, some of that may be true, but I'd like to get a realistic sense of that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, well, Hamas is a fundamentalist group, so I would say from what I've researched and people I've spoken to, it is a pretty narrow vision of how things should be. Hamas is a Sunni group, and they come from the Muslim Brotherhood, so they share a lot of the same ideology with the Muslim Brotherhood. Their kind of philosophy, I guess, is that Islam, the glorious days of Islam, back in the days of the great Islamic empires, we kind of went astray from that by allowing modernity in, by allowing the influence of the West, by allowing the evils of colonialism and globalism to kind of corrupt the true Islamic ways. So the idea is to kind of return to the Islam of this era, and I guess arguably to the Islam of the Quran. And that does manifest itself in things like in Gaza of increasing segregation between men and women, but also on the other side, great Islamic charity. There's a huge number of charitable organizations in Gaza working to enable that, I guess, to happen. So I guess I hope that kind of covers the
Gives me an idea.
orthodoxy in it. Yeah. Let's see what else we have in the questions here.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead. Who was that piping up? Thank you.
Sarah Jane here. I was just wondering, early on, you were talking about the way the Gaza Strip and how and the different formations of it and all that kind of thing, and you talked about areas being depopulated, and nothing more was said about it. And I think that what concerns me is just by saying the word depopulated, you sort of skip over, I assume, what was actually happening at the time. And I think that it's really important to have a kind of a real understanding of what actually went on at that time, because I think that this is one of the reasons why maybe, I remember I went to, I've been to Israel twice. And one of the, and actually I went to a really good green olive tour, excellent. But the other one I went on was full of those kind of euphemisms about what was actually going, and words that kind of described things which, and then it was skipped over. And so I think that maybe there might be some, if you could just explain to me what you meant by depopulated.
Sure.
The truth,
yeah.
What actually happened.
Yeah, so I guess first I should say there's a lot that gets skipped over in a 45-minute presentation, so I concede that was skipped over. I don't have any doubt that there was an ethnic cleansing which took place in Mandatory Palestine, what became Israel. There were over 700 Palestinian villages which don't have any people living in them anymore. Depopulation, you're right, is a bit euphemistic and can be kind of used to mask what is basically a war crime. There's various things happening in various places. That's also part of the complication. There are many villages which were completely empty by the time Israeli forces arrived there. I mean, it's quite natural, I think, to voluntarily flee fighting. And a lot of historians spend a lot of time kind of splitting hairs about whether things were actively depopulated or whether people voluntarily leave. To me, that I look at it from a more human point of view. You've become a refugee. You're not in the place where you lived before. Exactly how that happened is, to me, personally, a little bit of a moot point. But there's something called the Plan Dalet, which is an Israeli military plan, and there are many quotes you could, pull out from many of the great Israeli leaders. Even people like Ben Gurion, who talks about the desire to effectively have the land but not the people. And I guess to wrap it up, definitely there are provable cases of villages which were actively depopulated. That means soldiers coming in and forcibly telling people to leave their homes, and if they don't, shooting them. And there are also cases of the people voluntarily leaving kind of on their own accord. So I hope that kind of gives a bit more depth when I talk about depopulation.
Well, it makes the whole sorry saga more understandable, I think. I mean, it's, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Sarah. Let's just have a look and see what else we have in terms of questions. If Fred has nominated anybody. We're also pretty much up for time, so I think we may have to call it at that. I do hope that for those of you who are still here, you enjoyed the presentation, that you found it interesting, that you found things you maybe didn't know before. And I do hope that the question and answer section wasn't too confusing with the technological problems that we had there. As I said at the beginning of the tour, if you did enjoy it, we thank you very, very much for whatever you feel the tour was worth and for your contributions. We can send another link in the chat there. And we'll be doing more virtual tours like this. We'll be doing more virtual Gaza tours, virtual tours of Jerusalem and other places in the coming weeks and months. So please stay tuned to Green Olive for more information about that. And most of all, don't let the humanitarian crisis in Gaza kind of fall to the wayside, because I think, if nothing else, that's maybe the most important message to come out of the whole tour, is that really what is going on there is a crisis. And as the United Nations said, by 2020, this year, things are unlivable there. So our hearts, minds, prayers are with the Gazan people. And we hope that by presenting their story in some way today helps their situation. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. We hope you enjoyed yourselves, and hope you have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever in the world you are today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.